The evening assembly session aboard True Station, Meridian, was running later than usual, which meant Thomas Kane would be stuck monitoring translation protocols until well past his normal shift. Not that he minded particularly. The diplomatic facility paid well for communications engineers willing to work the neutral zone, and the overtime helped him save enough credits to eventually transfer back to civilian space, where people didn't spend their days arguing about ceasefire violations and territorial boundaries. The Central Assembly Hall was an impressive piece of architecture that blended human engineering efficiency with Zephyrian aesthetic sensibilities. Crystalline panels in the walls shifted color in response to the emotional resonance of the speakers, while the distinctive counterpoise benches were arranged in careful geometric patterns that supposedly promoted balanced discourse, according to ancient Zephyrian governmental theory. Thomas found it all rather pretentious, but he had to admit the acoustics were excellent for his translation equipment. Tonight's session was particularly crowded due to reports of renewed tensions in the Outer Rim colonies. Representatives from both species filled the benches, their animated discussions creating a low hum of conversation in multiple languages that his systems worked overtime to process and convert into comprehensible diplomatic discourse. The translation algorithms were functioning smoothly, but Thomas needed to maintain visual contact with the proceedings to ensure accuracy during the more heated exchanges that tended to strain the automated systems. Most of the available seating was occupied by diplomats, military advisors, and various governmental functionaries, who took these evening sessions seriously enough to arrive early and stake out positions with good sight lines to the central speaking platform. Thomas usually sat in the back where he could monitor his equipment without drawing attention, but tonight even those seats were filled with observers eager to hear the latest updates on the colonial situation. That was when he noticed Princess Zarathi, sitting alone on her usual bench with a conspicuous empty space beside her that no one else seemed willing to occupy. The Zephyrian royal was something of a legend aboard the station, though not in a particularly flattering way. Diplomatic staff from both species referred to her as the Mad Princess, in hushed tones, citing her unpredictable behavior and the unsettling way her metallic skin shifted through chaotic color patterns that defied normal Zephyrian emotional displays. Thomas had seen her at previous sessions, but had never paid much attention to the whispered stories about her supposed instability. From his perspective, she seemed sad rather than dangerous, isolated by others' fear and prejudice rather than any genuine threat she might pose. The empty space beside her had become a symbol of her alienation, a zone of exclusion that seemed unnecessarily cruel regardless of whatever behavior had earned her the reputation for madness. The practical problem was that Thomas needed somewhere to sit where he could properly monitor the translation systems during what promised to be a lengthy and complex session. Every other seat was occupied, and the discussion was already beginning to include the kind of technical diplomatic language that required his full attention to process correctly. The empty space beside Princess Zarathi was the only available option, and his job required him to be present and alert regardless of social complications. Without overthinking the implications, Thomas walked over and settled into the empty seat beside the isolated princess. He nodded politely in her direction, the same basic courtesy he would show to any colleague, and activated his portable monitoring station to begin tracking the session's translation requirements. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Conversations throughout the assembly hall came to an abrupt halt as representatives from both species turned to stare at the unprecedented sight of someone voluntarily sitting beside the Mad Princess. The crystalline panels in the walls shifted to colors that Thomas didn't recognize, but that seemed to indicate surprise or shock among the Zephyrian observers. Princess Zarathi herself seemed startled by his presence, her metallic skin cycling rapidly through silver, blue, and gold patterns that suggested complex emotional responses Thomas couldn't interpret. Her eyes, large and luminous like all Zephyrians, but with an intensity that was distinctly her own, met his with an expression that combined surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been cautious hope. "You," she began, her voice carrying the musical harmonics characteristic of her species, but with undertones that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being addressed directly by anyone. "You are not afraid." "Of what?" Thomas asked, genuinely puzzled by the question. "You're just sitting here listening to the same diplomatic discussions as everyone else. What's frightening about that?" Before she could answer, the assembly hall's information systems activated with a harmonic chime that indicated some kind of protocol activation. Thomas's portable monitoring station suddenly displayed access notifications for databases and files that should have been far beyond his security clearance level. His routine translation monitoring had somehow been upgraded to include diplomatic archives, governmental communications, and classified intelligence reports. "The counterpoise bench," Princess Zarathi said quietly, her skin patterns shifting to configurations that seemed more stable and purposeful than the chaotic displays Thomas had observed before. "By sitting beside me during an active session, you have triggered ancient witness protocols that grant us joint authority over the proceedings." Joint authority. Thomas stared at his suddenly expanded access permissions, which now included files labeled with classification levels he'd never even heard of. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," she replied, her voice carrying new strength and clarity that contrasted sharply with her reputation for instability, "that you and I now have the legal right to review any information relevant to tonight's discussions, and the authority to call for emergency protocols if we discover evidence of threats to public safety." Around them, the diplomatic session continued, but Thomas could sense an undercurrent of tension as representatives from both governments began to realize the implications of what had just occurred. Whispered conversations in multiple languages created a background buzz that his translation systems helpfully converted into fragments of concern about unprecedented protocol activation and security complications. "This isn't what I intended," Thomas said, though he found himself oddly intrigued by the sudden access to information that might help him understand the complex political situations he'd been observing from the technical sidelines. "I just needed somewhere to sit." "Intent is irrelevant to ancient protocols," Princess Zarathi replied, and for the first time since he'd known of her existence, she seemed completely lucid and purposeful. "The counterpoise bench responds to actions, not motivations. You chose to sit beside someone no one else would approach, and the law recognizes that choice as a commitment to shared witness." Thomas began browsing through the newly accessible files, his engineering background helping him navigate the complex database structures, even as he tried to process the political implications of what he was reading. What he found was troubling. Patterns in the ceasefire negotiations that suggested systematic manipulation, financial irregularities that implied corruption at high levels, and communication logs that revealed coordination between supposed opponents. "Princess," he said carefully, "some of these files suggest that people on both sides have been working together to prevent the ceasefire from becoming permanent peace, almost like they want to maintain the current state of controlled conflict." Her skin patterns shifted to configurations that seemed to indicate satisfaction mixed with vindication. "You see it too," she said. "The patterns that everyone else dismisses as the ravings of a mad princess. I have been gathering fragments of this evidence for months, but my isolation has prevented me from accessing the comprehensive files needed to prove the conspiracy." "Conspiracy?" "A smuggling network that uses the ceasefire period to transport illegal goods, technology, and—" Her skin darkened to colors that suggested deep distress. "People between our territories. The network depends on maintaining exactly the right level of instability, enough to avoid the scrutiny that would come with formal peace, but not enough to trigger the security responses that would accompany renewed warfare. Thomas felt a chill as he began to understand the implications of what she was describing. His technical background helped him trace the logistical patterns in the data, revealing shipping routes, financial transfers, and communication networks that painted a picture of systematic criminal activity protected by political manipulation. "How long do we have to review this information?" he asked, realizing that their joint witness status might be temporary. "Until dawn," she replied. "The counterpoise bench requires us to remain seated together for the entire session to formalize our authority. If we leave before morning, the protocol ends and our access is revoked." Thomas looked around the assembly hall, noting the increasing number of concerned glances in their direction, and the small groups of officials who seemed to be engaged in urgent whispered conversations. Their investigation had clearly not gone unnoticed, and he suspected that powerful people were already working to ensure they wouldn't be allowed to complete their unexpected role as joint witnesses to whatever corruption they were uncovering. "In that case," he said, settling more firmly into his seat and activating additional monitoring protocols, "we'd better make the most of the time we have. If there's really a conspiracy manipulating both our governments, someone needs to expose it." Princess Zaratha's skin brightened to patterns that seemed to indicate hope and determination, and Thomas realized that her reputation for madness might have been the result of her attempts to share information that no one else was willing to believe or investigate. Together, they began the work of piecing together a puzzle that could either save the peace process or destroy both their careers, assuming they lived long enough to present their findings. As the evening session progressed, Thomas found himself drawn deeper into the web of information that their joint witness status had unlocked. The classified files revealed a conspiracy far more sophisticated and extensive than he'd initially realized. Not just simple corruption or profiteering, but a systematic manipulation of the entire peace process by individuals who had found the current state of controlled conflict extremely profitable. "Look at these shipping manifests," he said to Princess Zaratha, highlighting patterns in the data that his engineering background helped him recognize. "The same transport vessels that are supposed to be carrying humanitarian supplies to refugee camps are also making unscheduled stops at private facilities in both human and Zephyrian space." Zaratha's skin shifted to patterns of deep concentration as she studied the information, her metallic surface displaying configurations that Thomas was beginning to recognize as indicators of complex thought processes rather than mental instability. "Those facilities," she said, cross-referencing the locations with her own research files, "are owned by shell companies connected to Lord Chancellor Voltek's private investments and Earth Corporation's subsidiary networks." Earth Corporation. Thomas felt a chill of recognition. "That's one of the major defense contractors supplying our military forces in the neutral zone. And Lord Chancellor Voltek has been the primary advocate for extending ceasefire negotiations rather than moving toward permanent peace," Zaratha added. "He claims that rushing toward final agreements would be premature and dangerous." The picture that emerged from their investigation was disturbing in its scope and cynical calculation. The same individuals who publicly advocated for careful, measured progress toward peace were secretly coordinating to ensure that such progress never actually materialized. They had created a profitable status quo that allowed them to exploit both the humanitarian crisis and the military tensions without facing the accountability that would come with either formal war or formal peace. This financial data shows massive transfers between accounts controlled by officials from both governments, Thomas discovered, his systems analysis skills helping him trace the complex money flows that funded the conspiracy. They're not just profiting from weapon sales. They're running a complete shadow economy based on maintaining exactly the right level of conflict. "The refugees," Zaratha said quietly, her skin darkening to colors that suggested profound distress. The camps that have been temporarily housing displaced populations for 2 years. They're not temporary at all. They're supply sources. Thomas followed her logic and felt sick as he understood what she meant. The refugee camps weren't just holding areas for people displaced by the conflict. They were recruitment centers for forced labor, research subjects, and worse. The humanitarian crisis was being deliberately prolonged to maintain a steady supply of vulnerable people who could be exploited without oversight or accountability. The communication logs show coordination between refugee camp administrators and the private facilities, he confirmed, his technical background helping him decode the encrypted messages that revealed the true scope of the human trafficking operation. They're literally selling people, disguising it as emergency relocation and medical assistance. As they worked together to piece together the conspiracy, Thomas began to understand why Princess Zarathi had been labeled as mad. Her pattern recognition abilities allowed her to see connections that others missed, but those same abilities made her aware of horrors that no one wanted to acknowledge or believe. Her chaotic skin patterns weren't signs of mental instability. They were the result of constant stress from processing information about systematic atrocities, while being unable to find anyone who would take her seriously. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. "Months. Fragments at first, inconsistencies in official reports, suspicious financial transfers, communication patterns that didn't match public statements. But every time I tried to share my concerns, I was dismissed as unstable, unreliable, a princess whose isolation had affected her judgment." "They isolated you deliberately," Thomas realized. "Not because you were mad, but because you were getting too close to the truth." Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Ambassador Harrison, the senior human representative on the station, who approached their bench with the kind of forced diplomatic smile that suggested serious displeasure barely held in check. "Engineer Kane," Harrison said with careful formality, "I need to speak with you about your current seating arrangement. There seem to be some security concerns about unauthorized access to classified materials." "The access is fully authorized under Zephyrian counterpoise bench protocols," Thomas replied, not moving from his seat. "Princess Zarathi and I are serving as joint witnesses for tonight's session." "Those protocols weren't designed for human personnel," Harrison continued, his diplomatic mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine alarm. "Your security clearance doesn't extend to the materials you're currently reviewing, and continuing to access them could constitute a violation of interspecies intelligence agreements." Behind Harrison, Thomas could see other human officials gathering in small groups, their expressions suggesting urgent concern about the unprecedented situation. Simultaneously, Zephyrian court representatives were engaging in hushed conversations with officials whose skin patterns indicated similar levels of alarm about the activated protocols. The materials we're reviewing indicate systematic violations of ceasefire agreements and humanitarian law, Princess Zarathi said calmly, her skin displaying patterns that Thomas was learning to interpret as controlled authority rather than instability. "The counterpoise bench grants us the obligation, as well as the right to investigate these matters." "Princess," Ambassador Harrison said, his tone shifting to include the kind of patronizing concern typically reserved for addressing people considered mentally incompetent. "I'm sure you believe you found important information, but perhaps these documents should be reviewed by individuals with the proper expertise and security clearances." Thomas felt anger rising as he recognized the dismissive tone that Zarathi had probably been facing for months. "Ambassador, the documents clearly show coordination between officials from both governments to maintain the refugee crisis and exploit displaced populations. This isn't a matter of interpretation. It's documented criminal activity. Engineer Kane, you're exceeding your authority and your expertise," Harrison replied sharply. I'm ordering you to terminate your access to classified materials and report for immediate debriefing about potential security violations." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Thomas said, surprised by his own determination to continue the investigation. "The counterpoise bench requires joint witnesses to remain seated together until dawn to complete their authority. Leaving before then would terminate our access to information that could save thousands of lives." Around them, the diplomatic session continued with the kind of formal discussions that Thomas now recognized as elaborate theater, designed to maintain the appearance of progress, while ensuring that no actual resolution was reached. The representatives debating territorial boundaries and trade agreements were either unaware of the criminal conspiracy operating around them, or were actively complicit in maintaining it. "The evacuation routes," Zarathi said suddenly, her attention focused on a new set of files that had appeared in their shared access. "The delays in opening safe corridors for refugee populations aren't due to bureaucratic complications. They're being deliberately blocked to maintain the supply of vulnerable people for the trafficking network." Thomas traced the communication networks that coordinated the bureaucratic delays, finding evidence of systematic obstruction disguised as procedural caution. Every request for expanded evacuation assistance had been routed through committees controlled by individuals connected to the smuggling network, ensuring that humanitarian aid never reached the levels that would threaten their criminal enterprise. "We have to present this evidence," he said, realizing that their joint witness status might be the only way to bypass the normal governmental channels that had been compromised by corruption. "The ancient protocols you mentioned, do they include provisions for emergency disclosure?" "They do," Zarathi confirmed, her skin brightening to patterns that suggested hope mixed with determination. "But using those provisions would require us to present our findings publicly, before the full assembly and broadcast to both governments simultaneously. We would be directly challenging some of the most powerful people in both species." Thomas looked around the assembly hall, noting the increasing attention their conversation was drawing from officials who clearly preferred that their investigation remain private. Security personnel from both governments were positioning themselves strategically around the chamber, and he suspected that powerful interests were preparing to ensure that their evidence never saw the light of day. "How much time do we have until dawn?" he asked. 6 hours, she replied. 6 hours to complete our investigation and decide whether to use our joint witness authority to expose the conspiracy, or to walk away and let the status quo continue. Thomas studied the evidence they'd gathered, documented proof of corruption, human trafficking, and systematic manipulation of peace negotiations by individuals who were supposed to be working toward humanitarian solutions. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but the evidence was undeniable. "Then we'd better keep working," he said, settling more firmly into his seat. "If this is our only chance to expose the truth, we're going to make it count." As they continued their investigation, Thomas reflected that his simple decision to sit beside someone who looked lonely had unexpectedly placed him at the center of a conspiracy that threatened the lives of thousands of refugees and the stability of the entire peace process. But with Princess Zaratha's guidance and their combined access to classified information, he was beginning to believe they might actually be able to make a difference. The situation in the assembly hall grew increasingly tense as representatives from both governments began to realize the implications of Thomas and Zaratha's unprecedented investigation. Security personnel had taken positions throughout the chamber with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested they were preparing for more than routine crowd control, while urgent whispered conversations in multiple languages created an undercurrent of alarm that Thomas's translation systems helpfully converted into fragments of concern about security breaches and unauthorized disclosure. Lord Chancellor Voltec himself arrived just after midnight, his imposing presence commanding immediate attention from the Zephyrian representatives. His skin displayed the formal patterns of high governmental authority, but Thomas could see subtle color shifts that suggested barely controlled anger underneath the diplomatic facade. "Princess Zarathi," Voltec said with the kind of measured tone that carried implicit threats, "your recent behavior has caused considerable concern among the court counselors. Perhaps it would be appropriate for you to receive medical attention for what appears to be another episode of your ongoing instability." "My instability," Zarathi replied calmly, her skin showing patterns that Thomas now recognized as controlled defiance rather than mental confusion, "seems to consist primarily of discovering information that others would prefer to keep hidden. Information obtained through unauthorized access to classified materials," Ambassador Harrison added, approaching the bench with his own security detail. "Engineer Kane, you're in violation of multiple intelligence agreements and interspecies protocols. I'm ordering your immediate extraction for security debriefing." Thomas felt the weight of official pressure from both governments, but their investigation had revealed too much evidence of systematic criminal activity to simply abandon. The trafficking network they'd uncovered wasn't just exploiting the current crisis, it was actively working to perpetuate and expand it for profit. "The files we've accessed show that the refugee crisis could have been resolved months ago," he said, addressing both officials directly. "The delays in opening evacuation routes, the bureaucratic obstacles to humanitarian aid, the technical complications that keep preventing progress, they're all deliberate obstruction designed to maintain a supply of vulnerable people for exploitation." "Engineer Kane," Harrison said with the kind of patience typically reserved for addressing children or people considered mentally incompetent, "you're a communications technician, not a political analyst. You lack the expertise and security clearance to properly interpret the complex diplomatic information you've accessed." "I'm an engineer," Thomas replied firmly. "I understand systems analysis, data patterns, and logistical networks. And the patterns in these files clearly show systematic coordination between supposed opponents to maintain profitable instability." Around them, the diplomatic session continued with increasingly hollow debates about technical details and procedural complications that Thomas now understood were part of the elaborate theater designed to maintain the appearance of progress while ensuring no actual resolution was reached. The representatives arguing about territorial boundaries and trade agreements were either unaware of the criminal conspiracy operating around them or were actively complicit in maintaining it. "The communication intercepts," Zarathi said, accessing new files through their shared authority, show direct coordination between refugee camp administrators and the private facilities where displaced persons are being trafficked. "The delays in evacuation assistance aren't bureaucratic inefficiency. They're calculated to maintain inventory levels for the trafficking network." Lord Chancellor Voltec's skin shifted to patterns that Thomas's cultural briefings had taught him indicated severe displeasure. "Princess, these paranoid delusions have progressed beyond mere eccentricity into dangerous fantasy. You are making serious accusations against respected officials based on misinterpretation of complex diplomatic materials." Misinterpretation. Thomas pulled up the financial records that traced money flows between the trafficking network and officials in both governments. "These aren't diplomatic materials, they're banking records, shipping manifests, and encrypted communications that document systematic criminal activity. Look at this transaction, logs showing payments from Earth Corporation subsidiaries to Zephyrian Noble House, accounts for special procurement services." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Detailed records showed how the refugee camps had been deliberately maintained at overcapacity to create desperation that made trafficking easier. Medical facilities, supposedly treating plague victims, were actually conducting unauthorized research on human and Zephyrian physiology. Supply shipments listed as humanitarian aid contained weapons and technology transfers that violated every ceasefire agreement. The scope of this conspiracy extends far beyond simple war profiteering. Zarathi continued, her pattern recognition abilities helping her trace connections between seemingly unrelated activities. They've created an entire shadow economy based on human suffering, with the peace negotiations serving as cover for systematic exploitation. Ambassador Harrison exchanged glances with Lord Chancellor Voltec, and Thomas could see the moment when both officials realized that their carefully constructed conspiracy was being exposed in real time. The security personnel around the chamber shifted position with practiced efficiency, moving from protective stances to more aggressive formations. "This has gone far enough," Harrison declared. "Engineer Kane, you are relieved of duty and ordered to report for immediate psychiatric evaluation. Your judgment has clearly been compromised by extended exposure to alien mental influences. And Princess Zarathi will be returned to medical custody for treatment of her ongoing psychological disorders," Voltec added. "These delusions of conspiracy have clearly worsened beyond what can be safely tolerated." Thomas felt the trap closing around them as security forces from both governments prepared to forcibly separate them and terminate their joint witness authority. The ancient counterpoise bench protocols that had given them access to the evidence also made them vulnerable. They had to remain seated together until dawn to formalize their authority to present their findings, but powerful enemies were now mobilizing to ensure they never reached that deadline. "The emergency protocols," Zarathi said quietly, her skin showing patterns that suggested urgent determination. "We have the authority to invoke immediate disclosure if we discover evidence of ongoing threats to public safety. Using those protocols would mean broadcasting everything we've found to both governments simultaneously," Thomas realized. "No going back, no diplomatic channels, no opportunity for the conspiracy to contain the damage. It would also mean directly challenging some of the most powerful people in both species," she warned. "They have the resources and influence to destroy both our careers and possibly our lives." Around them, the assembly hall buzzed with tension as officials from both governments coordinated their response to the unprecedented situation. Thomas could see Ambassador Harrison speaking urgently into a secure communicator, while Lord Chancellor Voltec issued orders to Zephyrian security personnel. Whatever they decided, they had to decide quickly. "The refugee camps," Thomas said, accessing the latest intelligence reports through their shared authority. "According to these files, there's a major relocation operation scheduled for tomorrow that will move 3,000 refugees to temporary processing facilities. Based on the pattern we've uncovered, those people are going to disappear into the trafficking network." 3,000 lives, Zarathi said, her skin shifting to patterns that reflected the weight of moral decision. "We could save them by exposing the conspiracy, but only if we act before our authority is terminated." Thomas looked at the security forces positioning themselves around their bench, then at the evidence that could save thousands of lives, but would certainly destroy any chance of returning to his quiet life as a communications engineer. The choice was stark: personal safety and career preservation, or exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatened everything the peace process was supposed to protect. "How do we activate the emergency protocols?" he asked. Zaratha's skin brightened to patterns that seemed to indicate hope mixed with fierce determination. "We stand together and formally declare our findings before the full assembly. Once we begin the disclosure, the protocols protect us from interference until we complete our testimony. And after we complete it, after that, we face whatever consequences our enemies can arrange." Thomas could see Harrison and Voltec approaching with their security details, clearly intending to end their investigation before it could proceed further. The moment of decision had arrived. They could allow themselves to be separated and let the conspiracy continue, or they could take the leap of faith that their evidence would be enough to protect both them and the thousands of victims trapped in the trafficking network. "Princess," he said, standing up from the bench and offering her his hand, "I think it's time we address the assembly." As they rose together to invoke the ancient protocols that would either save thousands of lives or destroy their own, Thomas reflected that his simple decision to sit beside someone who looked lonely had led to the most important choice of his life. But with Zaratha's guidance and their shared determination to expose the truth, he was beginning to believe they might actually be able to make a difference that mattered. As Thomas and Princess Zarathi stood together to invoke the emergency protocols, the assembly hall erupted into controlled chaos. Security forces from both governments moved quickly to surround their position, while officials scrambled to understand what was happening and how to respond to an unprecedented situation that none of their contingency plans had anticipated. "By the authority of the counterpoise bench," Zarathi declared, her voice carrying across the chamber with the formal harmonics of ancient Zephyrian law, "we invoke emergency disclosure protocols for evidence of ongoing threats to public safety and violations of interspecies humanitarian agreements." The crystalline panels in the walls responded to her declaration by shifting to patterns that indicated the activation of formal governmental procedures, while the assembly hall's communication systems automatically opened channels to broadcast networks throughout both human and Zephyrian space. Whatever they were about to reveal would be transmitted simultaneously to billions of viewers across multiple star systems. "Engineer Kane," Ambassador Harrison called out as his security team attempted to reach their position, "you are ordered to stand down immediately. This disclosure is unauthorized and constitutes a severe breach of interspecies security protocols." "The disclosure is fully authorized under ancient law," Thomas replied, his engineering background helping him understand the technical aspects of the broadcasting systems that were now activating around them. "And the evidence we're about to present involves crimes against both our species that supersede normal security considerations." Lord Chancellor Voltec had mobilized his own forces, but the emergency protocols created a protective barrier around the joint witnesses that prevented interference during their testimony. The ancient Zephyrian lawmakers had apparently anticipated attempts to silence inconvenient revelations and had built safeguards into their legal systems. "Citizens of both human and Zephyrian space," Zarathi began, addressing the cameras that were now broadcasting their testimony across the galaxy, "we present evidence of a criminal conspiracy that has exploited the peace process for profit while causing immeasurable suffering to refugee populations." Thomas activated the holographic displays that began showing the financial records, communication intercepts, and shipping manifests they had uncovered through their investigation. The evidence streamed out in real time, creating an undeniable record of systematic corruption that implicated dozens of high-ranking officials in both governments. "The refugee crisis that has displaced millions of people could have been resolved months ago," Thomas explained, highlighting the bureaucratic obstruction that had prevented humanitarian aid from reaching those who needed it. The delays in opening evacuation routes were deliberately engineered to maintain a supply of vulnerable people for trafficking operations. The evidence was devastating in its scope and detail. Documented communications showed coordination between supposed enemies to maintain profitable instability. Financial records revealed massive profits flowing to officials who publicly advocated for humanitarian assistance, while privately ensuring that such assistance never materialized. Shipping manifests proved that vessels supposedly carrying aid were actually transporting weapons, illegal technology, and human cargo. 3,000 refugees are scheduled for relocation at dawn, Zarathi announced, accessing the emergency codes that their joint authority had unlocked. "We are immediately opening all sealed evacuation corridors and deploying emergency medical assistance to refugee camps that have been deliberately denied proper care. As she spoke, Thomas watched security systems throughout the station respond to their commands, unlocking transportation networks and communication channels that had been restricted for months. Emergency broadcasts began transmitting safe passage codes to refugee populations, while medical teams received authorization to deploy resources that had been held back by bureaucratic obstacles. The conspiracy began collapsing in real time as officials implicated in the trafficking network attempted to flee or destroy evidence. Ambassador Harrison's own communications revealed his involvement in suppressing humanitarian aid requests, while Lord Chancellor Voltek's financial records showed massive profits from the private facilities that had been exploiting displaced populations. The peace negotiations themselves have been theater, Thomas continued, displaying the strategic analyses that proved how conflicts had been deliberately staged to prevent lasting resolution. Both sides have been manipulated by individuals who found the current state of controlled conflict extremely profitable. Around them, representatives from both species watched in shock as the scope of the deception became clear. Many of the diplomats and officials had genuinely believed they were working toward peace, unaware that their efforts were being systematically undermined by colleagues who had different priorities. The emergency protocols continued to protect Thomas and Zarathi as they completed their testimony, but they could see security forces preparing for whatever actions would be possible once the ancient legal safeguards expired. The evidence they'd broadcast was undeniable, but powerful enemies would certainly attempt to minimize the damage and possibly eliminate the witnesses who had exposed them. The validation is complete, Zarathi announced as dawn broke over the station, her skin displaying patterns that seemed to indicate both exhaustion and triumph. The counterpoise bench authority is now formally established, and the emergency corridors are permanently opened under joint witness protection. Thomas felt a sense of completion as their testimony concluded, and the broadcasting systems confirmed that their evidence had been received and verified by oversight authorities throughout human and Zephyrian space. Whatever happened next, the truth was now public record that couldn't be suppressed or denied. The immediate aftermath was chaotic but encouraging. Refugee evacuation operations began within hours as transportation networks that had been sealed by bureaucratic delays suddenly opened. Medical teams deployed to camps that had been denied proper care for months, while investigation teams moved to secure evidence and arrest individuals implicated in the trafficking conspiracy. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the newly established Joint Humanitarian Coordination Center, reviewing applications for expanded refugee assistance programs alongside Princess Zarathi, who had been restored to her rightful position as a respected political analyst. Their partnership had evolved from an accidental seating arrangement into a deep professional friendship that served as a model for the kind of cooperation that made lasting peace possible. The Andromedan system applications are showing excellent progress, Zarathi reported, her skin displaying the stable patterns of contentment and purpose that had replaced the chaotic configurations of stress and frustration. The communities we helped establish are becoming self-sufficient ahead of schedule, and the corruption prevention protocols are working better than expected, Thomas added, studying the technical specifications for new oversight systems that made future conspiracies much more difficult to maintain. The transparency requirements we built into the evacuation networks have eliminated most opportunities for exploitation. The refugee corridors they had opened during their emergency testimony had saved thousands of lives and established precedents for humanitarian cooperation that extended far beyond the original ceasefire agreements. Thomas's engineering expertise combined with Zarathi's political insight had created new protocols for accountability and assistance that addressed both immediate needs and long-term stability. Any regrets about your career change? Zarathi asked, noting the technical manuals and humanitarian planning documents that had replaced his communications equipment. None, Thomas replied honestly, reviewing the latest reports from colonies where former refugees were building new lives free